property investment seems to have lost its appeal for up to 45% of Queensland investors. Well, that's according to the latest property investment survey conducted by PIPA, the Property Investment Professionals of Australia. Now, the survey found that many investors are selling up, and quite a few feel they're no longer in control of their assets. Now, that's a very, very different landscape to 12 months ago. In fact, it's a very different landscape to when the survey was conducted a couple of months ago, because since then, the Queensland Government has repealed its proposed land tax, which would have penalised property investors who owned dwellings in more than one state. It would have been charging them extra land tax. So I'm looking forward to my chat today with PIPA Chair Nicola McDougall, because despite this flip-flop, I'm sure you're still going to find our discussion interesting, especially as you compare yourself with what other property investors are planning to do. So, welcome to today's show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Each year, the Property Investment Professionals of Australia run their Property Investment Sentiment Survey, and they want to get a snapshot of the nation's property investment community. Now, compared to last year, the conditions have changed. The market's, well, I guess almost day and night. Prices are falling, interest rates are rising, consumer confidence is falling. While there are a lot of factors that drive our property markets, interest rates, inflation, supply and demand, I really do think there's confidence that's the biggest factor that affects whether home buyers and investors move on with their decisions or not. And boy, has that changed over the last year. So to get more details and insights from this survey, I'm pleased to have as my guest today, Nicola McDougall, Chair of PIPA. Hi, Nicola.
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, you've got a lot of publicity from this survey, and I know your fingerprints are all over it. You're actually been involved in formulating the questions to get a sense of what's going on. But clearly the market's changed over the last year. What was the biggest surprise you got out of this year's survey, Nicola?
Wow. As you know, Michael, it's the 8th annual survey and we run it every August. So we do it at the same time every year, so we can have that sort of currency of when it's run every year. And every year we ask a similar subset of questions. And then every year we also ask specific questions that are about things that are happening right now so we can understand what investors are thinking and feeling. When I started analysing the results, I could not believe the number of investors nationwide who'd sold in the last 2 years, but also the number of investors who indicated they'd actually sold in Queensland in the last 2 years. So for me, that was my oh my gosh moment when I was the first person to see the results, reading them through on my laptop. I went, oh my Lord. Now we actually have the data to show what's been happening in rental markets around the country, because prior to this, there was a lot of people having a lot of ideas of what they thought had happened to rental supply, but we always believed it was a combination of fewer investors buying in the last 8 years and a huge volume selling in the last 2.
Well, it's interesting because, as you know, our team at Metropole look after our clients' property investments. We look over after, I guess, close to $2 billion worth of assets in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. And it disappointed me, the huge number of investors who sold up over the last year or two from our rent roll, as it's called in the industry. And for the wrong reasons in my mind, because this was even before the Queensland tax. The market was strong. They did well. Agents knocked on their door and said, hey, I've got a buyer for you. And they sold it. And I said, but hang on, your property's done what it's meant to do. It's gone up in value. That doesn't mean you sell it. So when you dug into the statistics, what did you find out? Why did they sell?
The number one reason, you hit the nail on the head there, my friend, was making the most of the positive selling conditions at the time. So nationally, that was the number one reason why investors have sold at least one property in the last 2 years. The results obviously showed that 45% of those investors had sold at least one property in Queensland. So, I mean, I'd throw that back at you, Michael. I mean, as an investor in Queensland myself, I sold one last year and I'd had that property for 15 years. And I have been asked this question before, but I'd be equally back at you as an expert. And I'm not saying whether it was right or wrong for anyone to sell their properties in the last 2 years, making the most of rising market conditions. Certainly someone like me who's still got 20 or 30 years left in my career and, in the market. I guess in a way, part of the reason why I sold was the fact that, unfortunately, I don't have a diversified portfolio. And I just sort of felt, well, after 15 years, 10 of which weren't overly great sort of market growth, that it was time to sort of get rid of one of my properties, bearing in mind that I had a portfolio as a single woman as well. So all of those challenges and concerns at the beginning of COVID did cause me a huge amount of stress. And I think a lot of investors did the same. But do you think that's part, especially here in Queensland, do you think that's part of the reason why people sold, even though we know for wealth creation, not the best idea?
Okay, so I think one of the things is that we don't act rationally, especially when it comes around money. So Queensland in particular underperformed for a long time. If you look over the last 40 years, and that's how far back Australian Bureau of Statistics figures have gone, Melbourne performed the best. There isn't one Melbourne market or Brisbane market or Queensland market, but Melbourne performed on average around 8.2% capital growth over the 40 years, compounding. Brisbane was only about 7.8%. So it's had some, still over the 40 years, you probably would have doubled and doubled again and doubled again. The thing is, though, that there's long periods when it doesn't do anything. Queensland's had that period, a long period, and especially if it's apartments or townhouses, they didn't perform as well as houses. So people thought, now I've made some money, it's time to sell up. When in fact, I believe Brisbane going to, over the next decade, still be one of the strongest property markets because of the demographics, because more people are coming to it, because more people are going to have higher wages, because of the Olympics, a little bit, because it's going to create better infrastructure. So the gap is going to narrow between Brisbane and Melbourne and Sydney. But I also think if your property has underperformed and now it's suddenly doing well, when everything went up last year, you and I know that you could buy any property, go away on holidays, but you weren't allowed to, and come back. You were in Queensland. You were allowed to go away. We weren't. And then when you came back, it went up in value again. It went up so much. So it was probably a good time to look at your portfolio. See, is this the sort of property I want for the next 30, 40 years, as you said? Is this the sort of property I want to leave as a legacy to my kids and my grandkids? And if that's not, then it wasn't a bad time to swap over and get something better, because in the future, your income is going to be dependent upon the ability of your tenants to pay higher rent. So if you've got it in a good location and the right demographic where your tenants are going to be more affluent, that's the sort of property you should own in the long term. So I think, like you, a lot of people took the opportunity of saying, okay, what do I want moving forward?
Exactly. And in the research, because obviously we've released the actual research report in entirety, but generally in the media, we've only talked about a number of factors, which I presume we'll be talking about next. But what was interesting in the results when we asked, why they sold, investors, number one, rising property, making the most of the rising property conditions at the time, market conditions. Number two was to reduce total borrowings. And
people are nervous about rising interest rates and inflation, aren't they?
Yes, and number three was changing tenancy legislation becoming
That's the big one I want to talk with you about.
That was the reason why they sold in the last 2 years. And I don't have the data in front of me, but I think it was a very small percentage of people who may have sold because they wanted to do what you've said, which is perhaps get rid of a property that may be underperforming to purchase another one, which would have been the smarter play. Where, unfortunately, I think that there is a significant cohort of investors who have sold, maybe emotionally, and who won't be replacing those dwellings in their portfolios going forward, which will be, not the best for their financial futures.
Well, that's why we always talk about putting a strategic plan together and understanding your why, what you want to do. And we know the government's not going to look after us well enough. We know superannuation isn't going to be enough. So if you sell up, what are you going to do with it? Now, some people may put it into their superannuation or buy shares, and that's okay. But if you don't use your money wisely, what is the alternative? I wouldn't like to be depending on the government to look after me. So this is why I'm pleased to talk to you as chair of PIPA, because I think people, and there's lots of great professionals out there to give advice. They should actually be sitting down with the professional and understanding what their roadmap is, what their plan is. So if it's part of a plan, fine. But if it's not, why do it?
And obviously, Michael, we asked seeing the potential for that to continue in the months and years ahead here in Queensland and in other states and territories as well, potentially because of the much ridiculed Queensland Land Tax.
Well, there's lots of other things I want to talk about in the survey, but let's talk about that tax since you brought it up. So we know that the Queensland government has legislated, it's in legislation, it's not just thought about, that if you own properties in Queensland and in other states, and if you reach a particular threshold, people who own properties in other states are going to be paying land tax at a higher rate than if you don't. In other words, they're not taxing the other properties because they're not allowed to. It's not part of their legislation. And they can't even find out. So it's a self-disclosure thing. But you're going to be paying a penalty for looking after your financial future. And who's going to pay? The tenants.
Exactly, 100%. Yep, the tenants. So
they're going to harm the people they're most wanting to help. So in Queensland, it's not just the land tax, is it? But it's also the residential tenancy legislation with so many changes. And while somebody probably had a good intention, because there is the occasional slum landlord, you see them on TV, I think most property investors, we know most property investors are ordinary mums and dads who only own one or maybe two properties, and they're looking to secure their financial future. They're not greedy slumlords.
No, exactly. And I think, and it's even the narrative that, state governments have, or the Queensland government in particular at the moment, talking about these greedy landlords. Interstate land speculators is another one that came up from the Treasurer the other day. It's just about the terminology. Like, words matter, right? I really have always tried to change that narrative and reflect the fact that when I get the opportunity, that, like you've said, Michael, 71% or thereabouts of investors own one, 90% own two, a very small proportion of investors own six or more. And the majority of us, or all of us, all we're trying to do is improve our financial situation during our working lives and in retirement, and be self-funded in retirement. And it still beggars belief, I guess, for me, that seemingly that's a bad thing, that we're not going to be relying on the public purse in retirement.
Yeah.
I just don't understand it. It always scratch my head and wonder, when on earth did that ambition, a great ambition where we want to be self-funded in retirement, where we have paid our taxes throughout our lives, taken on, one or two property investments and all the additional costs that come with that over time, and clearly financial benefits over the long term and the risks. And then, but we're doing it so that we're not relying on the pension in retirement. It just seems so absurd to me that is the prevailing narrative in this country about it, and I'm doing everything that I can to help change that, and I know you are too.
Well, Nicola, we're not just doing that, we're actually providing a service, because there will always be a portion of the population who rents. Now, we're not talking about the socially disenfranchised ones. I believe that's the government's obligation and us as taxpayers to help people who are going to be disenfranchised. There'll always be those people. But a lot of people rent because they're moving interstate, they're moving to a new country, they're going through a divorce, they're going for a new job. So a lot of tenants are tenants not because they're poor, but because of their life situation. And in other countries, the government provides that accommodation. In Australia, it's been left to private enterprise, just like there's public transport and private transport, public hospitals and private hospitals. There's public supply of rental accommodation, but not enough, and private supply. And it's a business. We're providing a service, and if we don't, we're not going to get paid by our tenants who are our clients.
Well, and that's the thing, and you say it so succinctly that, how many decades was it ago that, our government stopped funding social housing to the degree that they used to, and I feel that they, certainly in the last 20, 25 years perhaps, just thought that investors would continue to shoulder the burden. So they thought that clearly so that they didn't have to spend so much on social housing. But then at the same time, they seem to always come up with new and inventive ways to tax us for the benefit of owning one or two investment properties, and also because we are, seemingly it's a bad thing that we are actually, providing accommodation for the majority of people that rent in this country.
Now, some people are going to be listening to this and saying, it's two people with vested interest ranting on. So let's put some numbers to it. Your survey found a staggering 45% of investors sold at least one property in the Sunshine State in the last 2 years. If you take that number and work out how many rental properties have gone off the market, it could well be, you were doing some extrapolation, 160,000 properties that were sold. But who bought them, Nicola? What was the conclusion?
That's right. We did actually commission some expert independent analysis for the data this year, just because obviously it was, quite profound, the information that came through from the survey. And the analysis that they did, came to the conclusion that of all of the investment properties that were sold around the nation, let's be honest, over the last 2 years, approximately 65% of those dwellings were purchased by home buyers. So we're talking about, existing owner-occupiers or first home buyers, which stands to reason that 35% were bought by investors. So what that means is that 65% of those dwellings, we can safely say, were taken out of the rental market because they were bought by home buyers, and we did have record home buying activity last year, and investment activity was still at record lows until relatively recently, even though the Queensland Treasurer likes to think the other way at the moment. The new analysis that we got done, yes, showed that 160,000 potential dwellings were removed from the Queensland rental market, which actually equaled about 30% of rental supply in Queensland.
30%?
That had been stripped from the rental market, potentially stripped from the rental market in just 2 years. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the survey was conducted in August this year. We asked investors what they'd been doing in the previous 2 years. The new Queensland Land Tax was only made law at the end of June. So we can safely presume that the majority of investors sold these properties prior to having any knowledge of the Queensland Land Tax.
So it's only going to get worse. So what's your sense of what's ahead considering this poor investment sentiment?
So we asked investors nationally what their intentions were in regards to selling for the next 12 months. 19%, a further 19% of investors indicated that they were considering selling.
That's one in five. When you put it that way.
Yes, in total, which is just extraordinary, So we have a significant proportion of investors who are thinking of selling in the next 12 months. Now, what's interesting with the results was that we asked them what were the reasons. We gave them, I think it was about 12 or 15 options of the reasons for why they were thinking of selling a property in the next 12 months. The number one reason was the Queensland new land tax. That was the number one reason for 31% of investors. Number two, on 29.6%, was that changing tenancy legislation again, which came up, as number three with the investors who had already sold in the last 2 years. But again, and the next two reasons are, I guess, more evidence of the fact that a lot of investors are feeling like they're losing control of their assets, because number three was the fact that they feel like they're losing control because of new or potential government legislation, and number four was the threat of rental freezes, which obviously has been in the media a bit lately. Certainly, the Greens have been proposing certain rental freezes, which they like to do from time to time.
Well, it's happened overseas, and while the Albanese government has suggested they're not going to even countenance it, who knows? But again, it's just a sign of what politicians think about property investors. Now, over the last couple of years, COVID's changed the way we work, the way we live, where we want to live. So I know you also looked at what people did. Did they move house? Where did they move to? And are they considering moving back? What did you find out about homeowners?
We did find out, because last year in the survey before, I think, we'd asked, whether they had moved during COVID and the reasons why. What was interesting with the results this time was that there was not a huge percentage of people who are actually looking at returning to their home bases from perhaps if they've moved interstate. Many of them seem to be saying that they would stay put. But generally speaking, for those people that had actually migrated, whether it was intra or interstate during COVID, the ones that were saying that they were wanting to go back home again were just generally because they were missing their family and friends. Some of them were because that they couldn't work from home anymore. But it certainly seemed to indicate that there wasn't a huge flood of people that were, okay, we've moved during COVID, we're going to head back again. The results from the survey didn't seem to indicate that was happening, notwithstanding the fact that there was a small percentage of people that would be heading back to their previous, home locations.
Well, the way we live, how we work's definitely changed since COVID, hasn't it, Nicola? Have you got any inkling of what property investors are going to do moving forward? Are they interested in buying an investment property?
What we can see is that investors, obviously we've had investors selling, but we still have a, significant proportion of investors who are looking to buy. In fact, 58% in this year's survey said that they believed that now was a good time to invest in residential property. That was slightly down on last year, which was 62%, and 67% said it was a good time to buy in 2020. I mean, you would know this, Michael. I mean, obviously market conditions have changed significantly compared to last year. We have softer markets, we have more supply, we have fewer active buyers out there. I mean, I would think that the percentage there is probably a bit on the low side, really. And that could even be the fact that the survey was conducted in August. And, since that time, we have seen a further, increase in interest rates, a further softening in prices. So strategic and sophisticated and educated investors should be thinking really that the next 12 months provides actually a lot more opportunity.
A window of opportunity, that's right. Yes, very much so. Now, you're a chair of PIPA. We've been friends for a long time, so you're also way back were a journalist and then the editor of Australian Property Investment Magazine, but you're also the author of a book. Now, I know you've ghostwritten a number of books as well, but you've written a book, The Female Investor. What made you sit down and write a book?
Oh, dear, Michael. I've had this question a few times since the book came out in April. I actually originally had the idea for the book in 2018, and I can't for the life of me remember if I had an epiphany. I must have had an epiphany so good that I can't even remember it. Why? I think it was the fact that I was about to get married for the first time in my 40s, and I had a portfolio myself that I had put together as a single woman. I guess I just wanted to write down everything that I'd learned over the time. I wanted to help women secure their financial futures. I really have this goal of helping to create the first generation of financially independent women. And obviously, as we know, unfortunately, the financial outcomes for women throughout their working lives and in retirement are generally far inferior to men's, including their superannuation balances. So I truly believe that if women could invest in residential real estate, and it could just be one, right? One property that they buy, they could be younger, they could be middle-aged, but if they bought that property and perhaps they even retained that property independently throughout their relationships, then that could make a big difference to their lives. And it's just also a recognition of the fact that, a lot of relationships still end in separation and divorce. So it would be really nice if each party of the genders actually had their own financial independence. It's great to sort of obviously join forces financially, but I still think, I believe that it's equally as wonderful to have some financial independence as well.
Well, somebody who's been around the block a few times, like you and I, would understand that. And while you make all these long-term plans, I guess you've also got a plan for your plans not to go to plan. And so protect yourself. So that's great. So what message have you got for the half of my audience who are female? And the males can listen in as well, because I bet you're going to have some advice that will help them as well. What's the main message you want to give to females, apart from taking it in your own hands?
Be in charge of your own education, I suppose.
A man's not a financial plan, is it?
Well, yes, and I don't mention that in the book, definitely not. And I think it's about women taking charge of their own financial futures. But I'm very clear in the book to make sure that they work with bona fide experts. Clearly, that involves PIPA members, people that are qualified property investment advisors, making sure that you're working with an expert who understands property investment. So that could be mortgage brokers as well, financial planners. We have an element of people out there that are purporting to know about property investment, but they really perhaps have ulterior motives. And I think with our book...
I think that's one of the things sorry to interrupt you, that you've got to be careful. Women are good intuitively, probably better than men at picking scams and bad advice. But when it comes to money, you can get a little bit emotional. So you've really got to be careful who you listen to, don't you, Nicola?
Oh, exactly. And I did a LinkedIn post recently about, just PIPA members and things like that. I mean, we have an element of people who, pretend to be PIPA members even. I think it's important for people to check that the expert that they are considering working with is in fact a bona fide expert. Check their credentials, check their memberships, whether it be, PIPA or other industry associations, licenses, experience. Make sure that they actually have done what they're talking about, what they're recommending to you. Obviously the best advisors out there are happy to pass on testimonials and things of that nature. Make sure that they can back up everything that they are purporting to tell you, and make sure that they're not trying to sell you a property when you're trying to buy one. I think that's really important, and that's obviously the domain of spruikers. When it comes to the 50% of your audience who are males, I will say this. While the book is targeted and called The Female Investor, because we need to help women understand property investment as a low-risk wealth creation vehicle, the information in the book is not gender-specific. So, you don't have to be a female to read our book. And we certainly have a great number of males who are not only supporting our book like you, Michael, but who have actually purchased it for their daughters, for their sisters, for their granddaughters.
Hey, that's a good idea.
Yes,
so I'm going to leave a link in the show notes.
Yes, thank you.
Please go to it. And Christmas is coming up, and what better gift than a gift of financial literacy? That's a good idea, Nicola.
I love that. Can I borrow that for my marketing if I find time to do
definitely.
that? It is the perfect gift, because what we're doing is, helping certainly the next, the younger generation to me or women of my age becoming more financially literate and being able to improve their financial futures. I mean, that would be an extraordinary gift, and one that can last a lifetime.
Definitely the gift that keeps giving, as they say. So do women make better investors?
Well,
that's a loaded question.
Oh man,
isn't
your business obviously has helped so many people. I can only speak from my own point of view, and I don't think it's about the gender. I think it's about the education and the risk profile and the ability, and even your background, your childhood. All of these things all come together. So I'm just going to let that one
go. A beautiful diplomatic answer. Well said. So in the show notes, I'm going to leave a link to Nicola McDougall's great book, also with your permission to the PIPA survey so people can see. And I think it's important for them to understand what the Property Investment Professionals Association stands for. And while it initially started many, many years ago, and we at Metropole Foundation members of it, the concept was really to get people to understand the advisors that you're speaking to are educated and are giving independent professional advice. I know the initial intention was to see if one could even get that license, but the government doesn't seem to have any intention of doing that. Wouldn't it be nice if we could actually have minimum standards? Most people don't realise there's no minimum standard for anyone who can get up on stage, on Facebook, on YouTube, on podcasts and give advice.
I know, and we keep fighting the good fight, as you know. PIPA, thankfully, over recent years, thanks for the foundational work from those in the beginning, our profile has grown more and more. We do have inroads to various levels of government and things like that. And I guess we have a platform now, which we've all been working towards for many years. I've been on the board for 8 years now, for example, is to continue in lieu of legislation in the space, which I don't think we're ever going to be successful in, even though we will continue to fight. What we're really trying to do is educate consumers to the point about PIPA, about our members, about QPIAs, where if they are ever considering working with somebody in the property investment advice space, that they only work with PIPA members And in that way, we can actually be more self-regulatory, and we don't have to, because the federal government clearly has no interest, different federal governments have no interest in this arena. So I guess that's where we're at now, which is a great position to be in, right? And at the end of the day, people like yourself, all of us over the years who have volunteered our time, is really just trying to improve the professional standards of people in the industry, but also to provide consumer protection as well.
Fantastic. So, Nicola, thank you very much for your time. Some interesting information in the PIPA survey, but I think I'd like to leave people with a message of don't get caught in the now with the negative media. You hear it all the time too, how much negative media there is. Take a big picture view, because this too shall pass. We're probably halfway through this downturn at the moment, and I feel that when inflation gets under control, and that may well be early next year, I think when interest rates reach their peak, people are going to realise, well, that's it. It's as bad as it's going to get, and they're just going to get back on with their lives. Let's hope the government doesn't interfere too much, Nicola.
Exactly, and I certainly, my investor buying intention is on the positive, so I intend to be adding to my portfolio in the next 12 months because it suits me personally.
And that's the right time to do it.
Yeah,
that's right.
It totally is. Versus when, last year at the peak of the market when people were being a little insane, not so much. So, yes, that's my intentions, and agree, Michael. Everyone's looking for the perfect time to purchase property, and, the perfect time is when it's right for you, definitely. But also at the moment, there's majority of people are sitting on those sidelines watching and waiting. So I'll be taking, the opportunity now to make my move.
Makes sense. Thanks for your time, Nicola.
Thanks, Michael.
As you could hear from my chat with Nicola McDougall, there's a variety of opinions on what's ahead for our property markets. Some people see the glass half full, some people see the glass half empty. Currently, I see a window of opportunity for property investors with a long-term focus. Now, I know some people will be thinking, oh, Michael, you're always optimistic. Now, I've been around the block a few times, so I have seen this stage of the cycle before. It doesn't worry me. As I say, to me, it's a window of opportunity. That's not because properties are cheap. However, I think when you look back in 3 years' time, the price of what you pay for a property today will definitely look cheap. In my mind, the window arises because consumer confidence is low at the moment. That's what the survey shows. And many prospective home buyers and investors, well, they're sitting on the sidelines. However, I believe early next year, many of these prospective buyers are going to realise that interest rates are near their peak. Inflation will have peaked because the Reserve Bank's efforts to bring it under control will have worked. And at that time, greed, FOMO will come back, greed will overtake fear, and it always does as the property cycle moves on. But the problem is consumer sentiment does play a very big role in the performance of our housing markets, and that's what's happening at the moment. So when consumer sentiment is low, potential property purchasers, they sit on the sidelines. And this shows up with the various market indicators, the vendor indicators, which I actually report every Monday night. You get it in Tuesday morning's newsletter and property update. We talk about things like days on market, how long it takes to sell a property, how many properties are being sold, how many vendors are putting their properties on the market, vendor discounting, all those sort of factors, auction clearance rates, which give us a good indication of what's going on. So at the moment, yes, we're in a buyer's market. But what do you mean to do in a buyer's market? You should actually take advantage of it. However, what tends to happen when sentiment shifts, and it will, quite quickly, the market moves. Greed overtakes fear, and as I said, it's most likely to do so early next year. And then we tend to see people feel more confident, and that they look for opportunities and they start buying properties or homes or other big investments as well because they feel more confident about their financial future. You'll also see over time the media changes its pitch. At the moment, it's all doom and gloom. And then you're going to start seeing mixed messages as we get closer to the bottom of the cycle, where there's going to be some positive stories, some negative stories. That's the way it works until eventually the media starts running stories of hope and success. And as that happens, more buyers are going to return to the housing markets and prices are going to find a floor and they're going to be stable for a while because then more vendors bring their properties onto the market. But eventually, prices start to pick up and this brings more sellers back into the market. Hey, you've seen this before, the cycle moves on. But currently, consumer sentiment is low. But having said that, Australia's housing and economic fundamentals are still sound. If you watch my weekly Property Insider video with Dr. Andrew Wilson, just go to propertyinsiders.com.au. You'll find we discuss these in great detail, as I do on the monthly Big Picture podcasts here with Pete Wargent. Now, sure, the Reserve Bank's hell-bent on slowing our economy to curb inflation, but as we've discussed before, the economy is still sound. The housing markets are sound. There's no distressed sales at the moment. Households are cashed up. Property values have grown considerably, and yes, they're falling, and they'll fall a bit further. But most Australians still are going to have significant equity in their homes. The fact that unemployment is at historic low levels and will remain that way means that despite all these other economic issues, as long as people have got a job, they're not going to sell up. Their mortgages are still going to get paid, and so we're not going to have a housing market crash, particularly in light of the fact that we've got a severe shortage of properties. And there's no risk of oversupply, as has happened in previous cycles, well, not in the foreseeable future, because first of all, building approvals are lower, but that's going to support house prices, but no one's building new apartment complexes, or very few, because they're not currently financially viable and won't be until property values rise again, in fact, rise considerably. That means the next round of apartments and houses is going to cost a lot more, pulling up the value of established properties. Okay, so what should you do with all this information? Well, as I said, I believe it's important to understand that currently there is a window of opportunity available to you if, and it's a big if, your finances are in order and everything's under control. So don't worry too much about the market. Pay more attention to your own personal situation. Because poor consumer sentiment, when all the other fundamentals are good, there's just simply some clouds covering up the sun. This too shall pass, and I'm sure the long-term uptrend in property values will prevail. Why? Well, spring follows winter. It has for 1,000 years. Thousands of years, it's going to do so again. In fact, I'm prepared to put my money on the fact that, well, I am. Of course, it's hard to buy property when everything seems to be wrong and when it seems the wrong thing to do, because the media keeps telling us, impending property market crash, your friends are saying, watch out. Now, everyone's got an opinion. There's 25 million property experts in Australia. Everyone's got an opinion on what's ahead, but that doesn't mean you should take their advice. There's lots of reasons to invest counter-cyclically. Now, I'm not saying try to time the market. It doesn't work that way. But history's proven over and over again that these are good times. There's less competition. You've got more time to research. You can select the right property. You can complete your due diligence. It's a buyer's market. You've got the upper hand for negotiations. Now, of course, you can't just buy any property. In my mind, less than 4% of properties on the market are investment-grade properties, because most vendors are holding on to their good properties. So anyway, as I said, don't try and time the market. The experts can't do that. But get your ducks set up, get your ducks in a row to take advantage of opportunities when they arise, and there's no rush. And our team at Metropole are in the market every day. They're watching buyer sentiment. They're seeing how sales are going. They're watching the signals. Our research department spends hours analysing data. Of course, the problem is most data most property investors look at, it looks backwards. It's backward looking. By the time you find out about how the market's going, it's already moved. So why not get our team on your side? Have a chat with my team at Metropole. Go to metropole.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, and organise a complimentary clarity consultation with one of the property strategists at Metropole. It would be a real shame for you to miss this window of opportunity. I'd love to be part of your ongoing wealth creation journey.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to point out that negative thinking is bad for your health. According to various studies and research findings, humans are their own worst enemy when it comes to how we think. The publication Psychology Today reported that 70% of our thoughts are negative. Really? Well, I guess some people are like that. In 2005, that was a while ago, the National Science Foundation did some research on how humans think. They found that humans had about 12,000 to 60,000 thoughts per day, and of those thoughts, they came up with the fact that 80% were negative. Even worse, they found that 95% of the thoughts we have today were exactly the same thoughts as we had yesterday. And if you think about that, that's true. Oftentimes the thoughts that we think are negative and they cause us to worry, and this leads to stress, which leads to a rise in the hormone cortisol. Excessive and continued production of this impairs our immune system and apparently opens the door for disease and infections. Now, have you had negative thoughts? What have you been thinking about the economy, the environment, the political issues? There's so much in the news that's always negative, pointing to the negative side of things. Every day I see people interacting on social media about things that are outside their control. Some of those reactions get heated and it's clear that it's causing them some stress. But the media knows this. It knows we react more to negative news than positive news, so they force feed us negative news just to get the clicks. There's virtually nothing you can do about most of the negative things that you read about or you think about. When you read or think about negative things that you can't control, it leads to long-term stress because you can't change the outcome of those negative things. Those thoughts will be repeated inside your brain over and over again. And as I said, this for many people causes long-term stress. You should only be thinking about things you can control in your life. Focus only on thoughts about things in your life that you've got control over. You've heard me say it before. I want you to be the pilot of your life, in control, rather than the passenger where you feel you're being dragged along. Why? Because you can take action on certain things. You can fix what needs to be fixed, and then you just move on, allowing the other thoughts to go away. So, my suggestion to you in this mindset message is stop thinking about things you can't control. It's a waste of your time and it's bad for your health. Well, I hope you got some benefit from my chat today. Now, if you did and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, do them a favour. Tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. All podcast apps have a share button. On Apple Podcast, there's 3 little buttons at the bottom. You just press them and you'll get the share button. Or tell the world by leaving a review. Now, I've got a way of saying thank you for listening to my podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au and you can pick up a heap of reports and ebooks to help you become a better property investor. I'll be back again real soon, but you can follow me on social media. Just look for Michael Yardney, or why not join my private Facebook group where every day I leave some little tidbit I don't leave elsewhere. Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael, but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?